If we're connected, it's too much to be saying. The channel 1911 after lunch radio. I learned to be manly by constantly playing of memories of Patton and how I first met you. The Environment Club, Pacific City. The falling the Twin Towers crashing and burning. Songs by Creed that I never knew I knew all the words to. Cause you stand here by me.
Good evening. I say that I am not the anarchist because I am not. And on the same subject, I would like to talk about terrorism of my experience of the free trade agreement between the Mexico and U.S., which has led to more than 36,000 truckloads of food crossing across the border between the Mexico and the U.S. daily, which has been the result of NAFTA, which was opposed by the Zapatistas under Subcommandant Marcos, who referred to the bill as a financial bomb. However, the U.S. does not negotiate with terrorists, and the U.S. has deemed the Zapatistas to be terrorists. But I guess it's different in Mexico, because in 2019, the Mexican National Guard went to Culiacan and apprehended Ovidio Guzman, cartel leader, at his house, and they had to let him go after that because of, he has had submachine rifles and rocket launchers poised in that neighborhood for years. And my grandmother was there, not at Culiacanazo, but she was in Chiapas, Mexico in 1995 when the Mexican government ceded territory to the Zapatistas, and she saw the men walking around with the masks over their face and wearing AR-15s across the chest, and she bought the merchandise, not the cocaine, the Kachina dolls. The Zapatistas don't sell cocaine, they're freedom fighters against free trade. But one thing that is not my experience is men wearing black masks carrying AR-15s is no freaking joke. In 2020, the men wearing black masks carrying AR-15s invaded the town of San Mateo, Oaxaca, and massacred 15 people, and it had something to do with the wind power deal that was going to make it more profitable for local leaders to get money from large investors in the U.S. But in 2020, the cartel of the Arrodillos set up men on the side of the road and massacred 10 people in an indigenous music band that was traveling up the road in Guerrero. So that's got nothing to do with the USMCA, but the USMCA is what has replaced NAFTA. And I would like to say that if the Mexican farmers are opposed to having wind power covering large farms in their territory, the Oaxacan farmers also don't like to have to plant a large amount of American yellow corn using American pesticides across every available hillside, which has been the result of tariff-rate quotas making favorable the export of local products by small farmers in Mexico, while meanwhile the vast supply of American import into Mexico becomes 1/3 of the corn product market. And this has been the result of NAFTA, which Subcommandant Marcos refers to as a financial bomb. But we don't negotiate with terrorists because terrorists are unreasonable, because they do not have reasonable beliefs. And like religion, the Israelis will get blown up by the Iranians if they have their own bomb. But that's not because the Iranians don't believe in Israelis, it's because they do believe the Israelis have their own bomb. But the US did not give that bomb to Israel, it was the French in 1954 in Dimona. And maybe we gave them one in 1973 as well. That would be between Golda Meir and Richard Nixon. You'll never know. Anyhow, the cause of Israel's value as a point of economic detente is inherent. One thing the U.S. and Israel did was sign the very first free trade agreement in the whole world, and its tariff rate quotas made it possible for small farmers to protect their dairy and wheat imports and exports in the European neighborhood, because the U.S. was only partially involved there anyway because we're not actually bordering their country. Israel had then signed a deal with Jordan, and that led to a deal between the U.S. and Jordan directly, creating the first free trade link between the U.S. and an Eastern Arab-type state. But in fact, the failure of the Russian and Egypt, Jordan, and Syria association is evident in that they have not since collaborated quite as well as they did in 1973 when Brezhnev sent a document to Nixon detailing a ceasefire between the US and Russia during the Yom Kippur War. But we didn't do anything bad. It was not terrorism when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1978, although it was terrorism when the Palestinians blew up 38 Israelis in a bus, although we had 1,000 dead Lebanese Palestinians on the floor at the end of 1978. It was qualified by the fact that Hezbollah was in support of the Syrian government, which killed about that many Jews in the Syrian civil war 10 or 20, 30 years later. And we find the Israelis to be reasonable because, well, they fought for their independence against the British just like we did. They are Jews, so they believe in God, and they have got a position as an economic détente state in the country and the world. We will find it that Israel and the European Union had signed on to some kind of small deal between the OPEC nations, but if the EU and Israel do not soon find a way to aggressively engineer an oil deal between the Gulf Cooperation Council and the GCC, we're going to find a serious emergency on our hands because the U.S. not going to be able to negotiate effectively with Hezbollah and Hamas when Russia and the GCC harmonize their pricing and China undercuts the European Union with superior oil deals because the U.S. does not negotiate with Hamas in Palestine, Hamas of Palestine, and Hezbollah of Lebanon, because we refer to both of those as fully terrorist organizations, whereas, in contrast, the Russians say that they're both legitimate socio-political forces. But the other reason that Americans do not negotiate with terrorists is because, well, terrorists don't know how to negotiate their bad business. Like, remember when Pretty Boy Floyd was telling everybody that he was burning the mortgage papers whenever he robbed banks back in the 1930s? Well, it turns out he didn't save anybody's small mom and pop-up store. And the other thing is that why the Nicaraguans, when they were selling cocaine during the Contra in the 1980s, it wasn't to destabilize the black neighborhoods, it wasn't to proliferate Mexican cartels, but it was only to fundraise their revolution. So this is like, well, Yasser Arafat, when he blew up those 3 planes in 1970 in Jordan, and he got his picture on the cover of Times Magazine, he was fundraising for the Arab cause. And I will state categorically, it is a different kind of terrorism. As long as you take the hostages off the plane before you blow up, it is not like that other kind of terrorism. Yasser Arafat's form of terrorism is more so like, Yasser, fat pig, Muammar, get off of your fat butt and do some exercises. And Hosni Mubarak for Mubarbel treating you. Ayatollah once, Ayatollah Khomeini times, if you don't exercise, you're never going to feel nasty. And now what is the connection between Islam and Christianity, and what kind of effect will this proliferation of free trade agreements have on the possible development of a one world government? Thank you.
Mil gracias por existir.
The spice came out of the water. You're feeling so. Gracias por existir. La esperanza de ser feliz nuevamente ha llegado. Tiempo de amor nació.
Mi forma de ser y también tu sonrisa es la gloria. Solamente tú sabes hacerme feliz. Mil gracias por existir.